Good afternoon. On behalf of the Collegiate Council on the United Nations and the Association of the Student Body, UCLA, I would like to welcome you to this conversation with Mr. Andrew A.E. Franklin, British Consul General at Los Angeles. Mr. Franklin has been in Los Angeles about 2.5 months now. He's served in many areas of the world, among which are China, India, Algiers, France, in Kabul, Afghanistan, in Formosa, and now we're very pleased and honored to have him serving with us in Los Angeles. Mr. Franklin will make some remarks by way of introduction, after which we invite you to ask questions and to raise points about which you may be concerned. Thank you for being here. Mr. Franklin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. If you may find it easier if I just speak, if you can't hear, perhaps you let me know. Reminded of the story of the person at the end of his talk who said, anyone that can hear me or can't hear me, got the reply, unfortunately, yes, you can. I wanted first to say a few words, perhaps, on England, simply as a background. I think it might help you to get a little bit into perspective the country that your delegation would be representing in the modern United Nations. But first of all, you start off with the easy course, the development, the historical background. Like any other country, you have to think a little bit in terms of the changes that have taken place. You go back to the end of the 17th century and the Italian men said England is noted particularly descending land, its mountains, its hills, its bridges, its fountains, its churches, its women, and its wood. And that was the end of the 17th century. Since then, you've also had quite a few changes. You can now say you've got a country of 51 million that is dependent essentially on imports. It's depends very much on its overseas trade, imports, exports. The resources inside the country obviously are limited. It is a country that is highly industrialized. We have there as sort of we are the largest exporters of motor car engines and trucks and chassis. 1/5 of our electrical industry's output is exported overseas. You will find that in some of the nuclear power developments this is also quite highly developed. I mention this because sometimes there is the feeling it is entirely an obsolete part of the country. That is certainly not the whole picture. You then have, at the moment, simply in simplest terms, the political structure. You've got 300, the latest government formation is roughly speaking 363 Labour members, 263 or so Conservative, 10 to 12 Liberals, Independent. This means that you have a socialist government with a majority, roughly speaking, between 90 and 100. Somewhat changes its position after the elections on March 31st. Before that, it was a government with a majority of 3 to 4, which makes any sort of affairs, international affairs, anything else, and does make things often a good deal more difficult. It is, I think, present government under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, I think it's probably true to say, I think he would probably also rather like to define it mainly as a pragmatic government. This is perhaps again something in the British tradition. There is a combination, particularly I think in foreign affairs, of idealism, but at the same time of a very fairly close understanding of what the possibilities and the realities of any given situation are. If you take that to the field of foreign affairs, you'll find one of the great limiting factors, of course, more recently has been our financial difficulties. There had been, in 1964, there was a deficit, balance of payments deficit, of about £870 million. That was reduced last year to the figure of about £370 million, and it is hoped by the end of this year that that balance of payments deficit will have disappeared. But that in its turn, that kind of thing in its turn can, of course, the economic strength of any country automatically must play quite a decisive role in determining its overseas and foreign policy. Now, if you go to and look at the foreign policy, particularly starting off with defence, the basic lines, the theory, roughly speaking, is as follows: that interdependence is regarded as basic for the national security in nuclear age. That interdependence then is a basic concept for security in a nuclear age. Going from that, you come to the next stage that in the long term, the only security, national-wise or world-wise, can be found if you can achieve general and complete disarmament under the United Nations, if you can strengthen the United Nations peacekeeping forces. And this is why that particular plank is one of the main objectives of the British government. There has been particular emphasis in the defence, in that particular field, there has been special emphasis on the need to cope with the dissemination or proliferation of atomic nuclear weapons. The emphasis on that, you will find, is underlined by the presence in Geneva of Lord Chalfont, who is a political minister who heads our disarmament, our delegation of the Geneva Disarmament Committee and Conference. You find the emphasis on the tasks of the United Nations, underlined by the fact that Lord Clarendon, again the UK permanent delegate at the United Nations, has cabinet minister rank and is a political appointment, which with us is rare in posts of this kind. Both those appointments were made in that way to underline the importance attached by the British government to these issues, because it is felt that here the whole future really does depend on reaching some kind of solution and making some kind of progress worldwide on those issues. It is, if you come down to the immediate problems, you will see that in the last white paper on defence, which also outlined the estimates, British defence estimates for the current year, you will find that our defence expenditure altogether was £2,070 million. That as a figure may not mean very much. It is 6.8% of the gross national product of the United Kingdom. This in fact is probably a higher percentage on defence than you will find in any other West European country, and I think it's probably higher than your own equivalent percentage. The problem, of course, immediately comes of having one cannot have commitments that are greater than one's economic resources. This comes out very noticeably in the Defence White Paper. Reviewing what some of those commitments are, you have, first of all, the fact that at least half the British forces, armed forces, are stationed overseas. You will get some indication by that alone of what the commitment in this sense is. The three main defence roles that the British government sees are: one, its strategic nuclear role, then its defence role and contribution to the forces in Europe under NATO, and then its worldwide or overseas defence role in support of stability and peace on an overseas basis, outside Europe. If you go to start taking the defence forces in Europe, you find that there are something like 50 to 55,000 British troops stationed in Europe, mainly in Germany, as part of the NATO force. That is a treaty obligation, and it is also, might be tempting occasionally to consider a partial withdrawal of that, but the British government's view has always been that the cohesion of NATO is an essential factor in the maintenance of peace and security in Europe, and that this force does contribute. It is also one that Britain's European allies are most anxious that Britain should retain in Europe. So there you have that 55,000 or so in Europe. Then if you travel further, you have commitments in the Mediterranean area. You have Gibraltar, Malta, Libya, Cyprus, responsibilities towards the central treaty association powers. Then Aden, the Aden base is likely to be left by the time the South Arabian state gets its independence, by the end of 1968. Some forces in Bahrain, then going some forces in East Africa, then going further afield to get to Malaysia and Singapore, where the British contribution in terms of forces on the ground again is about 50,000. The purpose, and they are part of this East of Suez policy contingent. The purpose is to assist in maintaining peace and stability in those areas. There has been the problem over confrontation with Indonesia. There have been the problems in Malaya, in Singapore, which I think without the presence of those forces might have been considerably more serious than in fact proved the case. Confrontation was not so great a problem. Our policy, the British government's policy, basically in Malaya and Singapore, is that as long as the governments wish to have British forces and wish to have this base with their consent, it will be retained, although it is hoped that if confrontation on the Indonesian problem improves, that the situation there becomes somewhat more normal, that it may be possible to reduce some of those forces. In the event of Malaysia, Singapore proving reluctant or unwilling to have those bases, as a certain amount of contingency planning with Australia is taking place about the possibility of the provision of facilities in Australia. Then again, going still further east, there is quite a strong garrison contingent in Hong Kong. I've just listed that just to give some indication of the fairly wide spread of those commitments, and it is essentially not just a British colonial or imperialist contribution. It is a contribution that is reckoned by most of Britain's allies to be a contribution towards world stability in those areas. Unless you see that in something in some detail, it is sometimes hard to see and to understand some of Britain's policies and problems. Now, to come more immediately to the United Nations issues, I thought that it might interest you, and the quickest thing would be very quickly to run through some of the ideas contained in the Prime Minister's speech at the United Nations at their General Assembly on December, I think it was December the 22nd, 1965, at the end of last year. The main points that he covered in that were the future of the United Nations, then went on to Vietnam and Rhodesia as two of the immediate problems which happened, and this is sometimes the historical accident and chance happened at that particular moment perhaps to be the most critical, possibly they still are. Although they are critical really in this bigger sense of they are the places where the boils have erupted, but the important thing is peace in a much is to remove the tension on the muddies, the things that lead to these eruptions, to remove that on a much wider sense and basis. That is, of course, where the importance of getting real East-West relaxation of tension, of getting down ultimately to the issue of where the world is not just faced with the alternative if peace breaks down of a sort of nuclear holocaust. Well, first of all, you have the problem with the United Nations, and this has been a very real problem. There are two possibilities. Is it a sort of debating shop, a talking shop, without really effective influence, or should it be that a place where ideas can be exchanged and people can say rude words to each other and let off steam, and in general find a little comfort in this process? Or should it really become and develop into something more? Should it really be a centre of world authority and of real power? The British government has always strongly advocated the second of these courses, that the United Nations should be strengthened, should be invested with real power and authority, and that this really is important for the future of the world, if we're going to have a future at all. Then, coming down to a few more detailed points on while the Charter primarily gives responsibility for the maintenance of international peace to the Security Council, it is the British government's view that it would be wrong to whittle away the authority of the General Assembly. On the peacekeeping machinery, it felt that more effective, more efficient, more speedy and more permanent a structure was needed and would have to be created. The financial problems of the UN should be put beyond doubt, and procedures must be improved so that the clear will of the Assembly or other UN organizations should not be frustrated by failure to provide adequate financial means. I think I'm right in saying that the British contribution is, after that of the United States, the second highest, and I think it is 7.8% of the expenses, although the contributions vary from organization to organization, not always the same percentage. But I think it averages out at that figure. I believe also to help over the last year, 1965, an additional grant of £10 million was given from the British government side to help over tide over some of the immediate difficulties. There's also the feeling that the UN should be made more effective in the military sense. Mr. Wilson gave expression to that, made that quite clear. Impediments to the creation of an effective military power and intervention must be removed so that the UN could act when a situation arose that could only be dealt with by military intervention. Machinery for the peaceful settlement of disputes must be improved, since it would be even better to prevent situations than to have to deal with them later with military means. Greater international responsibility in the economic and trade development problems with which the United Nations was faced. Developing countries must be assured of stable and remunerative prices for their primary products. That is what most of the newly developing countries live on. If they can't sell their products, no amount of financial relief is really going to be a long-term solution. This is usually put in the rather simple terms of trade, not aid. It is also in many ways, in the long term, a much more dignified relationship. There must be a drive forward on disarmament to secure an effective multilateral treaty of general and complete disarmament. This an enormous amount of importance is attached to. You know, the 18 Power Committee in Geneva has been working very solidly on that. Occasionally you can say to yourself, well, what does all this achieve? What has happened? What in fact has the Geneva Conference people reached at all? Have they got anywhere at all? As you look at it in that way, you find that even in the relatively short period since 1962, something has been achieved. The agreement was achieved on the partial test ban. It's not applied yet to underground tests, but it was applied to all other nuclear tests by the Soviet Union, the States, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Basically France and China did not join in on that. The things like the hotline means of direct communication that could in emergencies help to cope with possible misunderstandings in days when destruction can be a matter of hours or possibly minutes. The agreement that outer space, that nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction would not be used and launched in outer space was again an immense achievement. Also, the reduction in the total production of fissile material. This again was a very major, in some ways, a very major achievement. The banning of the underground testing has not made any progress yet. The proliferation and dissemination of nuclear weapons also is not got beyond the deadlock in the discussion stages. But it has been taken somewhere. And the progress achieved in some of the other directions does indicate that with patience, with repeated effort, you can get the possibility of getting somewhere do in fact exist. Now, to come to Vietnam, I thought very briefly you might care to hear the views expressed then by Mr. Wilson. They're not so that I should say that the position hasn't so changed so radically since then. Mr. Wilson asked the Assembly to agree on certain propositions. That the war was above all a tragedy for the people of Vietnam. That as long as it continued, there was a continuing danger that it could escalate into a major war. And that the fighting in Vietnam casts a shadow over the whole conduct of international relations. It was clear that no final solution could be obtained by military means alone, and those who counted on obtaining military victory and refused to come to the conference table were deluding themselves and imperiling world peace. The British Foreign Secretary, as one of the two Geneva Code chairmen, had repeatedly urged on his Soviet colleagues the need to reconvene the Geneva Conference, so far without avail. The British government had proposed through the Commonwealth an initiative which could have led to negotiations and to a ceasefire. Washington and Saigon had agreed to receive a Commonwealth delegation, but not Peking and Hanoi. The efforts of the Secretary General had been equally unavailing. The British government had sought and was still seeking to turn the key in Hanoi, where alone this matter can be decided. One of the consequences of willingness to negotiate would be an improvement in relations between East and West. If that dialogue could be developed, many of the issues which had dominated discussions in its assembly and its committees could obtain a more realistic perspective. But it was not enough for this dialogue to be confined to Western nations on the one hand and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe on the other. It was urgent as well to establish a dialogue with China, whether in the United Nations, in disarmament negotiations, or through improved diplomatic channels. There was a section on Vietnam and the Far East. On Rhodesia, the Prime Minister said that he hoped the Assembly would accept that no one could have done more than the British government had done to warn the then government of Rhodesia of the incalculable risks they were taking by their illegal declaration of independence on November the 11th. And that the British government had done everything in its power to agree a just and honourable settlement. Britain carried the responsibility for Rhodesia. In theory and under constitutional law, this is a bilateral matter between the British Parliament, who alone had responsibility of decision in Rhodesia, and the people of Rhodesia. But those in any country who believe that this can be contained within the confines of Britain and Rhodesia, those who do not recognise the fact that this is a world problem, both in what it symbolises and what its effect can be, such people are victims of self-delusion. It was the recognition of this fact which led the British government, within minutes of the illegal declaration of Smith and his colleagues, to send the Foreign Secretary to the UN to raise the matter in the Security Council. Britain accepted the responsibility for dealing with this matter, but having embarked on a series of measures of unprecedented severity, of considerable cost, and still greater risk to ourselves, Britain had the right to ask every member of the General Assembly to give their fullest support. Above all, Britain had the right to demand that its financial and economic measures were not frustrated by nationals of other countries. Many nations have criticised Britain for not invoking the use of military force to suppress the rebellion. It's a sad thought, I'm quoting Mr. Macmillan, that in this organisation created to maintain and establish the peaceful settlement of disputes, there is a deep disagreement between us on the questions of what is held to be our failure to settle this matter by warlike means. And their passions run deep, and every one of us understands this. But I say to them that whatever they propose is not the way to settle this problem. Britain would not let up until Rhodesia had returned to constitutional rule. The British government believed that given time and patience, it would be able to assert its authority effectively in consultation with those who could claim to speak more representatively on behalf of the Rhodesian people as a whole. The future of Rhodesia must be on the basis of a multi-racial harmony leading to democratic majority rule. But then, very briefly, some of the issues, I thought I'd just put those so that you would perhaps have something that you could agree with or disagree with, some kind of very limited perspective. And at that point, I'd like to throw the thing open to you. If you have any questions, please go ahead. I think some of you will be able to answer them better than I can. Please.
I wonder if you would care to comment on the possibility for the future, in the near future and so forth, of race becoming a greater issue in public politics in Britain.
In Britain itself, I don't think in Britain itself the racial issue will reach anything like the proportions that would make it a major issue. There are one or two areas where there is a very high concentration of coloured people, where sometimes this can create social and other problems. But by and large, I don't think that the problem of living together, going to common schools, or fitting in basically into the social system, I don't think that has been a really major one in Britain, partly perhaps because the numbers involved don't make it such a great issue. There have obviously been trouble in Notting Hill, in Birmingham, but I don't think it is an issue that really inflames public minds and feelings.
And just in view of the fact that you would refer to the small numbers of colored persons in Britain as mitigating against making this a major public issue, implicitly you seem to grant that if their numbers were larger, that the basic elements are there that might make it a greater public issue.
Yes, I think that could. I mean, I say simply partly because this number is very small, the issue is not a major one. But I think also the whole approach of Britain and the Commonwealth has consistently, and for a very long number of years, been one of cooperation over and across the racial barriers. I mean, at the last the Commonwealth Prime Ministers meetings, for quite a period of time now, the majority of those meetings of Prime Ministers representing are coloured Prime Ministers, not white. The relationship historically in the India, by that I mean the continent of India, Pakistan and India, there's never really been the great emphasis on colour prejudice or colour as an issue. The whole Commonwealth the whole attempt has been to try and evolve in the Commonwealth as well a multiracial organisation. I think it's one of the few organisations that has contained people of all races and worked reasonably effectively. No one's trying to underestimate what some of the points of difficulty, the points of clashing can occasionally be, but in this much wider picture, I think that historically too, the British government, a succession of them, have always tried to achieve something that looks beyond the colour barrier. In this particular speech of Harold Wilson to the United Nations, he came there again. He ended, in fact, with a conclusion that is relevant to your point, if I may read it. But once the world begins to split, not on the basis of ideology, but on the basis of colour, then all of us who have fought, including all of us have fought for, including the United Nations itself, will be consigned to the limbo of impractical experiments. You can't conceive of world government without a government based on the closest cooperation and on a basis of equality with other races, because you certainly can't think of it in terms of one Caucasian or white race alone, because it is such a, again, quite apart from anything else, such a minority.
With reference to the Commonwealth, sir, it's been quite a few years that I've been to the Western United Nations conferences, but the students there seem to have had great difficulty in comprehending the Commonwealth the consultation during the meetings of the United Nations. Now, I understand in recent years the chairmanship has moved from being the British always being chairman to a rotation of the chairing through the various delegations.
Certainly, you're thinking in terms at the United Nations. Yes. You're not thinking of the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference.
No, I'm just wondering whether the other people that have been withdrawing their support, withdrawing recognition from Britain, are they still participating in the United Nations weekly meetings?
I think you will find that is still the case. I'm not certain. While the Assembly is in session, I think you'll find that is the case. And it applies, of course, not. It doesn't just happen at the United Nations. It also happens that, for example, in the Foreign Office, there is an automatic exchange of information and telegrams to the various Commonwealth governments, and of course that is not only the old Commonwealth members, who sometimes put the white Commonwealth members, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, but it is the Commonwealth members as a whole. The consultation and the form of contact throughout, I mean, all sorts of things, whether this is at London, whether it is in Delhi or the various capitals, has on the whole been a close one and a special one, and this with time does build up, and it does mean some kind of relationship, and it is of immense value. It is of immense value at this particular time, because it's one of the things that goes across, because there is a temptation and a danger at a moment when a lot of countries are newly emerging to think purely in terms, in the somewhat superficial terms of colour and emotion and hate and race. And therefore this fairly long tradition of common consultation and getting on together and of trying to see problems from a little wider perspective is, I think, of great value. And I can't think of any other organisation than the Commonwealth where it has worked quite so well. Even there, I mean, it obviously runs into difficulties, but by and large it has worked.
Mr. Country General, we all know that Britain rules the waves, but now we also know that Britain waves the rules. I'm referring to the severe British import and valuta restrictions which were introduced 18 months ago on the mediation of Israel. Now, these restrictions seriously impede the trade and development for Britain's allies, especially within the EFTA. So I wonder why they were introduced and whether the British government considers to repeal these restrictions in the near future.
Well, when we were suddenly faced in Britain with a major balance of payments difficulty, one of the solutions, or one of the immediate remedies, which was very reluctantly imposed by the British government, was a 15% duty on certain, it was a limited number of exports. This in the meantime, it was said at the time that this was an emergency temporary measure because we were faced with a balance of payments crises, and when you are spending more, I imagine at UCLA this applies as well, when you're spending more than is coming in, you've got to do something about cutting your further expenditure. We said this would be a temporary measure. It has in the meantime already been reduced to 10%. And I think it certainly would be the hope that it would be reduced even further. I think that most of our EFTA partners, and I think most of the common market partners, also countries, also were fully aware, and I think most of them would have understood the reasons for this action. And I think they would certainly have endorsed their necessity, however much they might have deplored the fact that they were imposed. But it was essential at that stage to limit the spending. And our friends and allies and commercial partners would have been the first to say, you've got to do something about this. And of course, once you do something, it may be once you reduce your spending abroad, naturally some of the people that are selling to you will say, well, we didn't want you to reduce it as far as we were concerned. We should have done it somewhere else. This is inevitable. But we had been, and it was perhaps made necessary by by the decision to exclude Britain from the common market at that stage, which was well, this perhaps added to the strain and difficulties at that given moment. But that is perhaps controversial.
Yes, so then it helped the British economy actually.
Well, for the moment, it wasn't so much a question of helping the British economy. That when you're spending more than you're earning, you've got to do something about it. And when you decide you can't spend any more, whether it's on alcohol or on cigarettes, I mean, it may also help you, but it's forced on you by the circumstances of the position. But we have always made it quite clear that we wish to reduce this, and it was only on a very limited number of items, mainly, or quite a few of them, on the luxury basis. I mean, even on the funds for tourists abroad and so on, no attempt was made to save on that.
Sir, could you possibly outline the potential circumstances under which Great Britain might be willing to take part in measures necessitating the use of force and violence to bring about the fundamental political changes in South Africa? For instance, would Great Britain be willing to take part in the UN-sponsored military action in South Africa in view of conceivable future aggressive actions by South Africa?
Well, you had, I think, you saw one I read a second ago in terms of what the Prime Minister said in December, the end of December, on the use of force at the United Nations. I think I will just give you that again, when he said, it is a sad thought that in this organization, the United Nations, created to maintain and establish the peaceful settlement of disputes, there is a deep disagreement between us on the question of what is held to be our failure to settle this matter by warlike means. But I say to them that what they propose is not a way to settle this problem. The use of force, I think, would be, and the use of military, of armed would be most reluctantly adopted. It was, you will be aware that it was adopted, or a resolution was passed, and there was no opposition, although I think there were 5 abstentions, which authorized Britain to stop this oil tanker. You could say that this barrier supplying oil from the Portuguese territory to Rhodesia of the Security Council without any vote against that resolution, authorized Britain to stop a tanker. This could be described as the use of force, but it is there was at the same time an amendment to the British resolution which aimed simply at obtaining authorization to prevent this oil tanker changed its name and nationality and place of origin, but to prevent this going. That was what the British resolution aimed at. The amendment, there was an amendment which obtained 6 votes, which suggested that military force should be used to bring about the ouster of a white immigrant, a white settlers regime. That obtained, I think, 6 votes, which is not sufficient. It had 8. But I don't think you would find that this would have been a solution at this stage, which either Britain or the United States or many of the NATO powers would, NATO allies would in fact endorse.
I believe before you said that the United Nations should be more militarily effective, and it should have forces to be able to act when the situation arises reacting on only a military. Now, what would such a situation be? What would you
Where there is already armed conflict, I think you could think of a situation of, I think you could consider a situation of that kind where there is already armed conflict, either between one or more countries, or where there is already a situation of active civil war. But I think there would be very considerable reluctance by a large number of people in the United Nations to think that you could impose, that the United Nations could impose peaceful solutions immediately in terms of the military means, unless every other channel or every other possibility of reaching a solution had been tried first. It is just possible that at the end of the road people might say this, but I think there would be great reluctance to proceed to a military force. I think there would be the feeling that everything possible should be attempted to solve problems by discussion peacefully or possibly even by economic sanctions.
Making the United Nations military forces more effective, what specifically did Britain have in mind? Was this some sort of permanent force or?
Well, in the long run, of course. First of all, I mentioned pragmatic. One has got to realize it doesn't much matter. It isn't a question of what one country has in mind or what anyone has in mind. This can only be a general wish of what one would like to see develop, because the decision will depend on what a large number, the climate at any given moment. But there is the long-term thing, where you would say that if they have effective peace and world peace, if you achieve complete and full disarmament, you will still require some body that can speak with authority on international affairs and that can, if necessary, maintain the peace. That force, if you achieve disarmament, and get away from your east-west or your ideological conflict, that force would be considered, the long-term force would be the world authorities, would be a force of a United Nations basis. That is the very long term. But in the shorter term, it is a question of that where you had anything from sudden flare-ups, sudden crises, that you should have the United Nations with the ability at very short notice of being able to produce a force that can go to the place before the thing has spread and before things have become entirely out of hand. This would presumably be in response to action by the Security Council. There has in the past always been the problem that if and when it is decided and agreed and resolution passed that action should be taken by the United Nations, that there's then a time lag because there's no United Nations force available, and there is the question of going around to see who can contribute to the forces. This has so far been done to the mind. I think it's often been done on the basis of the neutral countries playing a very special role. Scandinavians, sometimes Indians, depending on the area.
Sir, other than what the Prime Minister said at the United Nations, I was wondering what is the present United Kingdom's policy or thoughts regarding the present U.S. policy in Vietnam with regards to?
What do you think the view in the United Kingdom is, the general public view? But I noticed that a paper, it offers a slight element of guesswork, but if you take a paper like the New Statesman, which is very much on the sort of left, wing, you may call it progressive, you may call it whatever you like, would say that in the Labour Party, the Labour MPs, 20, and possibly in the last House, and possibly in this House where the representation, Labour representation is slightly stronger, they reckon there would be 30 Labour MPs who would have fairly strong views approaching, in certain cases, the sort of hands-off Vietnam line. That would be 30, that would be about 10% of the Labour Party's representation in Parliament. This is I'm quoting this simply as a figure. I can't say for certain how accurate it may or may not be, but the New Statesman on an issue of this kind would normally not consider itself particularly interested in exaggerating or in minimizing the figure. Now that would be in the House. There was the other test, or a test that you might have had, was at the Hull by-election, which was about the last by-election in England and before the general elections. At that there was a Labour candidate, a Liberal candidate, a Conservative candidate, all official candidates of their party. There was also an independent Labour man who ran on a hands-off Vietnam policy, which by its very nature tended to be also, I would say, also largely an anti-American view. But it was noticeable, and I think it came as a great surprise to a lot of people, that he was in most things quite regarded as quite a hard-working and sensible bloke. There was nothing absolutely wild and wanting in other ways about it. But in spite of, and he had the support of some of the party organisation in his constituency, but I think the result of that election was that out of something like 30,000 votes, I don't think he got much over 500. Which came as a very great surprise, and it came throughout the country, and also, in fact, in those circles who felt very strongly and sincerely that this was a policy that where the Labour government had let the party and the country down, but very strongly on this. I think there was immense surprise to find that with the public, the support for it was almost negligible. And this is why I mentioned that the candidate himself was, in fact, in some ways, quite a good candidate. But he could get no on this one. He didn't, in fact, get any public support. And I think part of this was due to the fact that, again, the British government sent one of the British ministers went there, the Commonwealth mission went, every kind of attempt was made to try and get people to agree to negotiate, to come to the conference table and negotiate as a first step to armistice. And when you see that consistently rejected, it does become terribly difficult to say, well, this is all a one-sided business. American imperialist aggression and so on.
So what degree of force did British government intending to stop the flow of oil to our region? And what impact, if it's on the impact that it had on the indicators of some of the gold, commodity, and professional?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the beginning of that.
Could you please tell me to what degree of force was the British government going to stop the oil flow in the region?
Well, it isn't a question as to what degree. I mean, this is the thing that the British government was trying to make clear. It isn't a question of how far on this issue the British government would go. The sanctions on the oil issue were passed by the United Nations it was the United Nations Security Council, without, as far as I know, certainly with no one voting against it, that decided on economic and oil sanctions. This was last November, to be imposed against the Rhodesian government. So the decision there is, the decision there is a United Nations decision, and not only a British one. Even in terms of stopping this tanker, the British government took this to the United Nations, and the United Nations Security Authority, the Security Council, without a single abstention of the 15 members represented on that Security Council, supported and authorized the stoppage of this tanker. There was no voice that got up to say, no, this is wrong. This was not just a British policy. This was felt to be a United Nations policy. The criticism of the action of the British action or of the British resolution was, of course, by the people who said this did not go far enough, that Britain was being hypocritical, and that what should be done was the immediate use of force in a sort of fire and sword concept of that word. And this was something that the British government would be most reluctant in any circumstances to entertain, I would have thought, and I think many others. I mean, you can never predict everything for the future, but the last thing that anyone would wish to see is to see open fighting.
Excuse me. If you ask a question, would you kindly raise and present your question to Mr. President?
I'd like to ask, in view of your feeling that the United Nations should make the United Nations greater authority and central power, not just from a military point of view, what do you think would be any repercussions if there would be any of allowing the Chinese People's Republic and into the Security Council?
If there would be any repercussions from
making the Chinese People's Republic.
From making the Chinese People's Republic, yes, I think that quite clearly a lot of people would say, feel very strongly that this was a mistake. What I was quoting there was the view at this particular moment of the British government, which is that this is the right policy because you must get into dialogue, you must get to terms with a country of the size, of the power, of the technological, because now there is also the nuclear bomb and so on, that if you are going to get anywhere with the Chinese, you must be in a position to speak to them, in some recognized international forum. We have always, of course, said that diplomatic recognition or anything else is not a matter of approval or disapproval. It is simply an acceptance that there is this government which is in effective control of a given area. There are all sorts of countries represented at the United Nations that don't approve of each other, but it is still felt that it is a good thing that they should be there, and that at various times the problems affecting them or affecting others should be discussed with them present. And if you take non-proliferation or non-dissemination of nuclear weapons and all, you can see why there is some advantage in being able somewhere to have a forum where you could speak to the Chinese. A lot of others should say the Chinese should should themselves make slightly friendlier gestures or approaches or noises. This would make it much easier. People could then, as long as you invariably have or as long as you seem invariably to have the Chinese saying, being unpleasant to everybody else, certainly to everybody they disagree with in strong terms, that this might simply make One of the arguments might be that this might simply make the whole United Nations less workable. This is some of the opponents might well feel that. It is a matter of opinion.
We have some refreshments at the back of the room. I might suggest that we partake of those. If you would like to converse with Mr. Franklin further, if you have any questions you would like to pose to him or discuss something with him further, he will be most pleased to accept your questions and to discuss with you. Once again, on behalf of the ASUCLA and the Collegiate Council on the United Nations, I would like to thank Mr. Franklin very, very much for his presentation and for his discussion. And I think we've all been most informed. I think it's been a most useful presentation for the members of the model United Nations delegation, and I hope that they will do a very fine job in representing the nation of Great Britain and San Francisco. Thank you, Mr. Franklin.